Well, let's get more on the other decision by government today from the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana to now temporarily suspend the exemption for Eskom from the Public Finance Management Act. The exemption would have meant Eskom wouldn't have to not have to publish its wasteful, fruitless and irregular expenditure in its financial statements. It would have still had to publish that information in its annual report. You would have seen the huge outcry at this. The Minister Godongwana announcing the end of this exemption or the suspension of it today. Khaya Sithole is a financial analyst. Khaya, good afternoon to you. You explained to us earlier this week why the Minister implemented this exemption in the first place, that it would essentially, the intention was to help Eskom borrow money. There was such a big outcry. Has the Minister now done the right thing to basically retract that decision?
Good afternoon to the viewers. So as we highlighted in our previous conversation, the Gazette in its current form was quite simply nonsensical. I don't think there's any other word that captures the essence of what that Gazette was about. And the problem, Stephen, is that obviously when you read that Gazette on its own, without any other understanding of the context behind the decision and what the implications are, it was very difficult to know whether this decision made sense or not, and rightly so. People then simply said, well, this doesn't make sense, particularly when it is at Eskom. The problem was that the details behind the decision were contained in the private correspondence between the minister and the chair of the board of Eskom. Those documents do not enjoy the same level of legal stature as the Gazette itself. So if the minister was simply going to say this is the Gazette and the Gazette doesn't give much detail, of course it was never going to stand up for legal scrutiny. So therefore it made sense for him to withdraw it. The issue here, however, is that the minister has simply withdrawn the Gazette in its current form. He has not withdrawn his intention to provide an exemption to Eskom because obviously he has been convinced by Eskom, as he was convinced by Transnet, that it is necessary for this exemption to apply in order for them to at least address some of the issues that emanate from their audit reports relating to compliance with the PFMA.
You point to the internal documents between the correspondence between Eskom and the ministry. And after the outcry, those documents were WhatsApped to various people. I'm sure you got them hours before I did, Khaya. I don't know if the publication of those documents has really helped the matter. Sure, it's technical, but at the same time, I think people are so frustrated. They see this. I mean, this essentially really is National Treasury changing the rules to make things for Eskom rather than getting Eskom to comply with the rules.
Yeah, and that is the problem that we highlighted, in that it does unfortunately amount to governance by exception. And the key issue here is that the issues that Eskom has and the issue that Transnet has are issues shared by many other state entities. They are issues shared by many other municipalities, where there's a lot of people that run those organizations today who will argue legitimately that, look, some of these irregularities that are contained in the current reports that we have to be accountable for are irregularities that predated our arrival at this institution. So we are struggling to manage our daily management of this organization and also be accountable for the sins of the past. So that's actually a universal problem in South Africa. So if the minister is going to take the view that an exemption is warranted in order to avoid people having to account for things that they were not really around when they were committed, then that should be a principled decision rather than an exception decision. Because from now, what we've seen is that this is going to open up the floodgates where many more institutions are going to have perhaps even more legitimate and even more cogent reasons why they should also be exempted from the prescripts of the PFMA. So it's not very clear what motivated National Treasury to do this by exception rather than by principle. It's also come to light that they're now going to embark on a process of consultation. They published, I think it's a 10-day window period from the 11th of April, where they now want as many stakeholders to give inputs into whether this type of exemption should be granted or not and what the parameters ought to be. So it now appears that the exemption will only be reintroduced after the end of that consultation period.
So we have the National Treasury, I mean, often regarded, or maybe it used to be, maybe it still is, as the one department in government where things worked. I mean, we all remember the state capture period and how important the National Treasury was. Here we have the National Treasury literally publishing out of nowhere this government gazette. That's how it looked. Now they've retracted it, but then they're going to go and do it again anyway, as you point out. What does that lead us to ask questions about the National Treasury at the moment?
Well, they definitely have found themselves in a credibility crisis, and the credibility crisis is really based on the fact that clearly the processes that they should have undertaken internally before publishing the Gazette, those processes quite simply were not canvassed. Perhaps what they got from last year, from the way in which they were able to essentially put together the Transnet exemption with barely anyone noticing is that it gave them a false sense of hope that South Africans do not have any sense of vigilance. So that is definitely something that is a problem. It's also problematic where they now seem to have warmed up to the idea that consultations are necessary, because you can imagine that if National Treasury occasionally takes decisions without engaging in consultations with the key stakeholders, well, then that's not the type of National Treasury that we should have. So it's unfortunately brought the wrong spotlight on them. But unfortunately, Stephen, it does get worse because unbeknownst to the public, National Treasury itself stands to benefit from the existence of such an exemption, because if you do remember, they have this ongoing problem with an IT project called the IFMS project. That IFMS project is something that is a point of permanent dispute, permanent departure of opinion between them and the Auditor General. According to the Auditor General, the amounts of money that are being paid under the IFMS project actually amount to fruitless and wasteful expenditure because the project is not currently live. National Treasury has taken a different view. So in last year's deliberations, the Auditor General said, look, unless you guys agree to classify this as fruitless and wasteful expenditure, I'm going to give you a qualified audit opinion. National Treasury disagreed with that to the extent that they did not table their financial statements. Rather, they've decided to solicit an arbitration process, which is trying to find a way to get the Auditor General to bend to their will and agree with them. So the reality here is that if this exemption becomes the way things are, National Treasury will naturally simply invoke it for its own benefit and simply say that, well, we don't have to have the IFMS project seen from the same lens as it was, so therefore they'll get a clean audit opinion from the Auditor General. That will create a credibility crisis not only for National Treasury, but I suspect also for the Auditor General.
Thank you very much indeed, Khaya Sithole. Really do appreciate the time. So much going on in all of this.